we're going to try to structure the conversation to get some overview of where we think the relationship is right now, to dig in a little bit deeper on the nuclear problem and the nuclear program, since at various moments this has bedeviled everybody who's here on the stage. And then to talk a little bit about the technology relationship, about new territories in which President Trump and the government in Seoul can go push all of this, where the Lee administration is on a number of these issues. So let me start with this larger question. I was just on the president's trip to China. Obviously, this was a very different approach to China than the president had taken even in the first term. He was very much in the mode of trying to put together a détente of some kind. It was a little bit overshadowed by, very overshadowed by Iran and the American re-involvement in the Middle East, and I think to some degree that emboldened President Xi, as we saw. But this has made things all the more confusing, I think, in some ways, for the Lee administration, because they need to go navigate what's been a difficult economic relationship with President Trump, but they also need to keep the economic relationship with China as stable as they can. So let me start first with you, Steve, to ask the question. Every American president until President Trump's second term have emphasized a pivot to Asia, with Korea pretty much at the center of that effort. Not exclusively, but a big part. That's missing in many ways from the national security strategy. It doesn't play as big a role as it did even in the one when you were in office. Explain how we got there. Do we think that President Trump is less committed to the pivot and thus perhaps less committed to the relationship with the ROK?
So I think you have to put it in a broader context, David, than just the last 16 months of President Trump's second term in office. If you go back to when the notion of the pivot or the rebalancing of U.S. interests in the world was first tabled during the Obama administration, I don't think you find a track record across the intervening nearly 15 years that shows any success really in doing this in a meaningful way. And so it's not
They
just
talked about it, but didn't necessarily.
They all talked about it. Now,
Right.
and as you say, now it's not even front of mind in the conversation. Why is that in that broader context? Because the national security threats and the challenges of the world intrude upon the wishes of administrations and presidents to reorient their foreign policy. You know, how do you make a pivot to Asia in 2022 when Russia sends hundreds of thousands of troops into a European nation in a full-scale invasion? How do you pivot to Asia when you're President Obama grappling with myriad challenges in the Middle East, a brutal war, civil war in Syria, a rapidly advancing Iranian nuclear weapons program? It just, the Middle East, Europe, the rest of the world force themselves on the president's agenda. I still think there is a momentum, if not a momentum, an inertia toward more U.S. resources and more U.S. commitment to the Indo-Pacific. I actually think that is a steady line across all the administrations going back to Obama. I just don't think it's so easy to execute at the same time you're having to respond to other problems around the world.
John Choi, do you agree?
Anyway, thank you for having us here. My first time to Asia Society, and been a while to come to New York City. Consider it my second home, anyhow. I'm not so sure.
Hey, you and me both.
To be really honest with you, now that I'm back in academia, I can speak more frankly than, I guess,
That's
anyone
why we
else.
invited you back to the Asia Society.
I mean, as Consular General here, talk about commitment. I think the commitment is pretty out there, but the performance perceived by South Koreans rather different in a sense that if you're really committed to ROK-US relationship as we have been in very traditional sense, then why do you slam us with tariffs? One of the pillars that constitute ROK-US relationship is not only the military aspect of it, but also its economic aspect. I think that as a South Korean, we are very much proud of being not only the treaty ally, but also we are the ones that only country in Asia that has a free trade agreement with the United States, and we really enjoyed it in a very much two-way sense, very mutually in a way. But at the same time, we shouldn't be used to the so-called old way of alliance. I think the alliance should be very mutually beneficial, and also it has to be fair in a sense. As Steve and I were in the office at the same time, we talked about sort of rejuvenation of the alliance system. In other words, not only are we deterring North Korea from any type of provocative action, but also we need to be able to form a structure where we can diplomatically engage North Korea and also have China on board, and also make sure that we prevent Russia from engaging Pyongyang too much. They should be on our side. But nowadays, saying that things are just too complex doesn't mean that we cannot do anything about it. I think that because of what's going on nowadays, we just realized that South Korea can do a lot more to the United States for the future. We are essentially rebuilding your ship industry. And also, we do share a lot of future technological commitment. That would mean that I think that South Korea's rise has in part due to American commitment to our past and also the present. So it is up to us to incubate and set a new course based upon our tradition of the 70 or 80 years of alliance. And therefore, what I mean by I'm not so sure is that are we talking about pivot in a really, really old sense? Or are we talking about pivot in a really 21st new sort of fashion?
Kathy, this must seem like a pretty familiar conversation to you from your days as ambassador, because there would be moments when the relationship would wax and wane. There were constant questions during the time you were there about the nature of the China relationship and how South Korea could navigate that. And so I'm wondering, when you think back from your time there, which was now, 15, 16 years ago?
Yes, I arrived in 2008, right at
Yeah.
the beginning of the day Lehman Brothers collapsed.
Yeah.
I arrived as ambassador in Seoul.
Right. So we're creeping up here then on 18 years. What do you think has fundamentally changed from what you've just heard from Steve and Jung Choi?
Yeah, that's a big question. And yes, I do have a kind of a long perspective on it. And with respect, if I could say to the pivot, I was thinking about that. I mean, you mentioned the Knicks. I don't hear about pivots anymore except when I watch basketball.
Uh-huh.
And even when it was introduced, I remember, I think by Obama, there was some criticism of it. Does it mean
They
you're
had
kind
to
of
back off from
turning your back towards, so they called it a rebalance.
That's right.
But that's just a way of adding to what you said, that
Right.
yes, it's been a discussion for a long time, and I'm old enough to remember the 20th century too, and in the 20th century we said that the 21st century was going to be the Pacific century. That was the future. I'm old enough to remember Nixon going to China. So yes, this has a long history of what our relationship is with Europe, and we can go for with Asia as well as with Europe, but also the nature of our alliances, in particular our alliance with Korea. And yes, as the Consul General says, I'm not sure I'm going to get into comparing it to a marriage, but it has its ups and downs. And you talked about rejuvenating it. I know I was in Seoul in April at a conference where it picked up from a phrase in the the Trump Lee Jae-myung November joint fact sheet, which talked about modernizing the alliance. I think right now, I mean, I could go through a long historical thing, but I think right now that's a little bit anachronistic. I actually think that we are redefining a relationship. And I think even more fundamental with respect to the U.S. worldview is not, how we balance, rebalance, work in different regions. And I mean, Steve is right. The U.S. is engaged everywhere. I do think this administration this president seems to lean at times towards a kind of a sphere of influence idea, greater U.S. concentration relative to the past on the Western Hemisphere, a little bit less on Europe maybe, but that's all I think still being worked out. But when it comes
a little more his advisors than him. I mean,
on sphere of influence,
we pressed him on this a fair bit during our January interview with him, and he, sphere. I mean, he says, "Well, isn't the world sort of dividing up that way anyway?" But it doesn't sound like it's an initiative of his as much as it might be Secretary Rubio, for example.
Yeah, and I think as we've seen over the years, I mean, the U.S. has drawn back into its engagement and its importance. We are an interconnected world as much as we may want to try to be, securing our supply chains and all the rest. But I do think that there is, this is a moment with respect to the U.S.-Korea relationship, as deep as it is, and again, I've seen it since 1975 when I was living in Korea when President Carter was elected and sitting in a little restaurant in rural Korea when a Korean next to me said, 망했다, we're all dead. Carter's going to withdraw all the troops.
Yeah.
We could go through a lot of things. But I think that we're at a reflection now here in the United States, and I think is what do we mean by it? We've used the word alliance, our allies and partners. What do we really mean by that? And what are the differentiations and how do we redefine? And it's a very sensitive issue in Korea. I mean, it used to be in Korea and maybe even now, if you said, certainly as ambassador, and this is, if you said we're partners rather in Korean rather than 동맹 or the linchpin, Koreans would get nervous. Well, wait a minute, are we less important than Japan? Are we being downgraded? I think, we've moved beyond to understand this is a very complex relationship.
I'm glad you mentioned that because a question I wanted to ask you and also Kuyoun was, during the Biden administration, the most notable thing they probably did was bringing the Japanese and the South Koreans and the president together at Camp David, putting together that relationship, trying to operate not with the integration of, say, a NATO alliance, but certainly to make this much more operative. Do we think that had any lasting impact?
Well, I think that one of the most notable things that's happened over the last year is the ever-strengthening Tokyo-Seoul relationship.
Without the U.S. actually having
So
to be in the middle
I
of
think
it.
it's important we as Americans think about the bilateral element of that as well as the trilateral. And I do hope, I don't know if I'm here to give policy prescriptions, but I do hope the U.S. and the Trump administration will try to reinforce the trilateral aspect of it as well. But if I do think that one thing that needs, if I can say, an upgrade in terms of our diplomacy is actually to do more diplomacy. And by that I mean simple things like prior consultations. The Koreans were very nervous, I think it's fair to say. I know from reading the newspapers and my Korean friends that before President Trump went to China, there was not much consultation, before or readout after. That's the gardening aspect of diplomacy. Before the U.S. Took its actions in Iran, there was no prior consultation with allies, or for that matter, with the U.S. Congress, I guess. But
or with the Arab states
or with the Arab states. Yeah. That's kind of diplomacy 101 in the past world. And to the extent that we think about what we mean by allies and partners going forward, we have to think about what that relationship really looks like.
You've been very patient here, but tell us a little bit. First, reflect on what you've heard here about the nature of the relationship, but also tell us a little bit about what your sense is about the relationship between Korea, South Korea, and Japan after that Biden initiative.
Well, in regards to, first, I'm responding to all of the panelists' thought about the current relationship. I agree with most of the panelists' thought about the current status of the United States. I agree with Kathy about the United States. I believe the United States has not come up with the idea what kind of great power you want it to be in the first place. So that uncertainty actually create a kind of different way of managing international orders, if we ever thought about it. And at the same time, it is changing the way they treating allies and partners and even adversaries. So when it comes to United States gesture toward China, and when it comes to United States gesture to Japan and South Korea, which is one of the most critical allies in the East Asia, we are treating more harshly than the China, as Professor Chen mentions, and that's not the way the diplomacy actually conducted throughout the years. And we expect that our commitments, United States commitment remains secure and stable, but at the same time, it becomes more transactional to the contribution we are making to the United States primacy and leadership. So that's not the way the alliance and kind of entire secure architecture used to maintain, but that's how we are kind of feeling that the current administration in the United States are treating United States allies, which means that it is kind of destabilizing the kind of existing orders and existing way we are interact with the United States. So at that point, I would like to emphasize that the trilateral cooperations and actually the trilateral cooperations in the previous administration in South Korea has been become more effective with the initiative of the South Korean governments and the reciprocated effort by the Japan, I think. Of course, there was a kind of behind effort by the United States as well, but that was, I believe, that has a kind of geopolitical effect. Of course, that is kind of reciprocated by Russia, China, and North Korea and other authoritarian countries. Alignment, not fully, but alignment. But that creates kind of a pivotal kind of weight in the Northeast Asian security architecture, I think.
And while I have you, let me ask you one more because it'll take us into our nuclear discussion. One other aspect of the relationship that President Biden put together was a greater consultative relationship on nuclear strategy. And you saw South Korean officials show up at a strategic command and get involved in these sort of regular discussions. They weren't actually they were not promised that they would be part of a decision about nuclear use at any moment, but certainly on the strategy. We haven't seen a whole lot of that happen since President Trump came in office. So is that effort, I know you spend a fair bit of time on nuclear issues, is that effort to your mind in abeyance? Was it symbolic to begin with and therefore not much of a loss?
Well, I don't think it was symbolic. We're at the working level. We are still communicating, I think. Also, try to figure out how we can incorporate South Korea into the nuclear strategies of the United States, and we have suggest a number of different ideas to strengthen extended deterrence strategy of the United States as well. But I think the current United States administration has been more distracted to other issues, as mentioned by other panelists. And nuclear issue, especially when it comes to it is targeting North Korea and also potentially China and Russia, which is kind of nuclear multipolarity in the Northeast Asia. I think the current administration is taking a pause. I think that has been kind of back burners, given that there is no nuclear posture review and other strategic report.
So, Steve, you devoted how many years of your life to the nuclear negotiations? You'll never have those back, right? But I would say you made the most serious, the most comprehensive, and for a while, the most promising efforts along the way, and then came the meeting in Vietnam and the disagreement between President Trump in the first term and the North Koreans. And since that time, we think the North Koreans have continued to build. There was not a whole lot of progress or action on this issue during the Biden years. Where do you think we stand? And then what message does the failure of that once very promising effort, or at least the fact that it did not get you where you wanted it to go. What does that tell us for the current day?
Yeah, so I'd start by reframing your question a little bit because first of all, Hanoi did not end in disagreement. Hanoi simply failed to reach an agreement. And that's an important difference because there was no acrimony at the end of the Hanoi summit. It was just the gap was still too big between the two sides. The second misperception that I always have to correct in any conversation is that wasn't our last meeting. Just a few months later, the president, with less than 36 hours notice, invited Kim Jong Un to meet him in Panmunjom Village, and the meeting happened, and the North Koreans were willing to engage as well. And that meeting reaffirmed a commitment to continue to try to close the diplomatic gap. And so then there was a final meeting that I had with my then North Korean counterpart. It was the third negotiating counterpart I had in 3 years. And that meeting was not a successful meeting, I can say. It was probably some preconceived plan to brush us back a little bit. It wasn't productive at all, but that was our last meeting. And then COVID hit. And I have
Remind me of the date of that meeting.
It was the first week of October of 2019.
Yeah.
In Stockholm.
And so COVID came the next spring, and that was the end of that.
We all went back to our corners. The frequency of meetings was never faster than every few months anyway with the North Koreans. It wasn't like we met in rapid fire succession, but once COVID hit, it became impossible. For the remainder of the Trump administration. So I think that's important. So, going back to your question though, that the North Korean nuclear weapons complex continues to chug along. That was the fundamental issue on why we didn't reach an agreement in Hanoi. And I think there's been some disclosures by officials in South Korea, public disclosures in recent weeks, that confirm in the South Korean view that the North Korean nuclear weapons complex is far larger than was publicly understood. And what was on the table in Hanoi was an agreement to end part of the North Korean nuclear weapons complex and essentially to accept that North Korea would continue to produce nuclear weapons with the lifting of sanctions and with the normalization of relations side by side. Now, there are some in South Korea today who argue that that's actually a good deal, that we should have normalized relations and we should have accepted the bit of the program that they offered us on the table and run with that package.
And see, for those who don't remember this history, for some of us it's blazed in our memories, unfortunately, from those days. But just remind us, at the time, the North Koreans were offering work within the Yongbyon plant. There were facilities that we had written about, others outside the plant where we thought nuclear activity was taking place. The president raised that, wanted that to be covered as well, and that was where the disagreement took place. Is that too much of an oversimplification?
No, I think it's fairly accurate.
And what we've learned in the past few weeks is that those facilities outside Yongbyon were considerably larger than we or maybe U.S. Intel knew, but that was sort of publicly acknowledged, because I don't think at that time you were even publicly talking about the facilities outside. I raised it with the president at a press conference. You may remember it there, and he talked about it a little bit, but there wasn't like much public discussion on the topic.
But you have the nub of the issue here, which is that, as I would oversimplify it, the North Koreans wanted everything. In exchange, they were willing to give us something. And it was something of a slogan around that summit meeting. In your close friend John Bolton was one who advanced this often, was everything for everything. But regardless, as a national security consideration, the second and third order effects of the United States accepting North Korea as a nuclear power at that point would have had consequences for geopolitical consequences well beyond the Korean Peninsula. And that's essentially what the United States would have been in a position to do, accept North Korea's production of nuclear weapons. At the same time, we would be lifting all sanctions and we would be normalizing relations. Another daunting consequence would be to convince the United States Congress to allow trade and investment with another country that was producing nuclear weapons in violation of non-proliferation treaty commitments, and certainly in a manner that posed a severe danger to security of the Korean Peninsula and to the Indo-Pacific and to the United States in general. It was inconceivable, and so there's kind of an unrealism to people who when they say, "Oh, we should have taken the deal." There was no deal to be taken there. Now that didn't mean it was a disagreement, because the North Koreans only brought this last thing to the table in literally the last 5 minutes of the 3 days in Hanoi. Literally in the last 5 minutes, as a kind of a last effort to try to achieve some victory. I negotiated with their counterparts for months in advance of the summit, and for a full week in advance of the actual meeting in Hanoi, and never once was this a proposal like this tabled. In the last 5 minutes, that's what led the president to say, "Let's keep at it. Let's see if we can close the gap. Let's see if we can get this to a place where both sides are willing to put on the table what they need to put on the table." And I think to this day, President Trump would be willing to do that. But I think the North Koreans have made clear, if anything, if nothing else, that they will not.
So one last question for you, Chung, and then also ask of Chung Choi and Kathy. President Trump has been very quiet about North Korea in the second term. If you think about what the first term was like, fire and fury by the first summer, the threats that ultimately did create the diplomatic channel that you described. And instead, there's been a much greater focus on Iran, and you could argue that, he basically thought the North Korean nuclear program was never going to get back in the bottle, but he had a chance with Iran. But what's your analysis, having spent so much time with him in the first term?
Well, I think it's still very much on his mind. He hasn't been bombastic, but he's not been quiet. During the campaign in 2024, he spoke several times on the campaign trail about his view of Kim Jong Un, his view of North Korea, his eagerness to resume diplomacy. He's done it several times since his time in office. It's not front of mind, and he's got probably a lot on his mind.
He's got some other things going.
And he just made some comments on Air Force One coming out of Beijing about.
I was there. I asked. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not that he's been quiet. I think the reality is there's no upside for North Korea to engage right now, and I think President Trump would be more than happy to, but I think the North Koreans find themselves in a very particular position where to engage with the United States at this point might cause them to have to manage the triangulation of policies like their support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or their support for Iran and relationship with Iran. And you could very much expect, just as Xi Jinping surely expected when President Trump comes, that everything's on his mind, and he says, "Hey, what can you do for me on this and that?" And there is no upside for North Korea to be drawn into some arbitrage about what they're doing in relation to Russia, and therefore there's no upside for them to engage with the United States right now.
I see you shaking your head, yes.
Talking about Hanoi itself reminds me of my day in the Blue House. At that time, I was Peace Planning Secretary for President Moon, and we are working on half and half scenario, meaning that if they achieve a deal, then it will be a big leap day forward from us. Or if they have no deal, then what are we going to do? Obviously, we had a no deal. But my take back then was that, it would have been really unrealistic for United States and DPRK to reach a deal on a single or very short period of time, given very long history of animosity and mistrust. And as we don't really talk about it very often. I think the COVID-19 factor was the most powerful element that impede United States and ROK and DPRK work together, because the image that we have toward DPRK is a very strong state, very cohesive state, but minus nuclear capacity, DPRK is essentially, very backward, weak state, so much so that they had to close down their own border for the next 3 years. So we did not have any physical contact with them, and our time was running out. And then you have change of administration both in Seoul and Washington, D.C. Looking at last 30, 40 years of history with North Korea and negotiation itself, I think that what matters is that what we can actually learn from it. In other words, we tend to have sort of reset in a very positive way every time we have a change of government in Seoul and Washington. This discontinuity creates much more strategic space for Pyongyang to manipulate both Seoul and Washington while pumping out whatever materials they have too. So, second point that I'd like to emphasize is that what really worries me is that Kim Jong-un is working in a very different time frame. I don't think that, I totally agree with Steve here that he will be the last person to show up to any type of diplomatic scene. Why? Because why would he? I mean, he only needs to wait a couple of years more so that, Trump might be gone. And one thing very much different nowadays than 2017-18 is that he has Putin on his back. And Putin was on our side, and he was even helping our side, United States and South Korea, but not any longer. So Kim Jong-un is essentially generating a lot of benefits out of Putin's and his relationship with Russia anyway by dispatching many troops to Ukraine war front. Only one though, so his strategic status is really, really rose. So I think that he's enjoying it as well.
They paid a high price for that. Many of the troops they sent were killed. Most of them had no idea where they were.
Yeah, some of the intelligence reports argues that fatality rate is about 50%.
Yeah,
much higher than what they experienced back in Korean War. But thing is, I don't want to sort of materialize what they benefited from participating in war in Ukraine, but what does it mean to the Korean Peninsula? And what does it also mean to ROK-US alliances? And what does it also mean to security landscape overall during the times of strategic competition between Beijing and Washington? I think the first and utmost concern that Seoul has nowadays is that whether we can go through this strategic competition in a way that protects our national security and maximize our national interest, and also maintain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. That way, that forces us to choose one or two options. The very first option is that let's raise our own defense capabilities much faster than we expect. I mean, there's also two kinds of social welfare, budget appropriation, and also national welfare budget appropriation. We are spending way much more than we think, and I think that's a wake-up call from Washington, D.C. I think that we are increasing by 3.5%. Doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to really hostile to any of our neighboring states. And the second option that we are taking is that let's be much more pragmatic. I don't like the concept of using the word balance. I don't like the concept of using so-called diplomatic equidistance because it's an old concept. What we are trying to do is that we're trying to come up with a rational choice where bolstering and beefing up our alliance with the United States while being very smart about handling our relationship with Beijing. We happen to live right next door to 700-pound gorilla, and we are making money out of it. So why not be strategic about it? But some of the folks in Washington, D.C. thinks that we're not really clear about our intention, but we are, I think, they're very smart about it. And last comment, coming back to Kim Jong-un, I mean, Steve and I experienced a lot of inner structure of decision-making process in Pyongyang. What worries me is that nobody in foreign ministry in Pyongyang or in their Politburo would dare to say, Mr. Chairman, it's about your time to come to the negotiation table and talk to us, President Trump. And Kim Jong-un would say, hey, have you ever met President Trump? I met him 3 times or 4 times. So I think that what happened is that Kim Jong-un will just wait out and maximize his relationship with Moscow and Beijing.
Kathy, it strikes me that when you arrived in 2008, 2010, it was still at least the official American position that we were going to reverse the North Korean nuclear program, that it was going to be possible to negotiate these away and all that. At the number of weapons they have today, I mean, one thing that strikes me when you talk to people in the Trump administration is they're not even trying to repeat that line anymore. I mean, they're basically acknowledging they're a nuclear power. We're going to have to figure out a way to go deal with them as a nuclear power. They won't say so on Meet the Press or Face the Nation, but they will certainly say so in private conversation. Is that significant? Do we think about this problem in a very different way if we began to approach it as an arms control problem rather than a we're going to get them to give up their weapons program?
Yeah, I think we do have to think about it in a different way now. And as I listen to these accounts of the trail of suffering and tears and blood, sweat, and tears, I kind of, it's not for lack of trying. I mean, over 40 years, I mean, we go back to the agreed framework or even earlier that there have been efforts by Washington, by Seoul, by the international community to prevent the acquisition of nuclear weapons by North Korea, and clearly it's failed. And I think now, and you're alluding to some of this, that maybe we do have to recognize the reality. I even have, maybe there's a thought that, the word denuclearization, as far as I know, only exists in Korean and maybe Chinese, bihekwa. So we don't use it in other contexts. And it's become rather empty. But I think for the United States and for other responsible actors in the world, one, we need to think of this in the context of the big challenge we have of proliferation, of the stagnation. There's probably the emptiness now of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which just had a conference where they were unable to reach the most milquetoasty, statement because of the issue of Iran, North Korea not even mentioned. There is the question of nuclear weapons and proliferation and risk reduction. So I'm not here to have a full policy proposal, but we have to look at it in that light. And that does mean, risk reduction means testing, communication. There's a lot that can be done. I think it has to be done in a multilateral as well as a bilateral context. But I think we also have to think about the future of the Korean Peninsula in a different way too. And you alluded to a lot of these things, but North Korea, at least for now, I think Kim Jong-un's pretty happy where he is. I mean, clearly his people are suffering, but it's kind of a little bit of back to the future in terms of him now being able to do something that, if I may say, Koreans have done skillfully for centuries, and that is kind of move between, they don't call it hedging, but move between powers like Russia and China. U.S. and Japan, whoever the great powers in the region. North Korea turns out to be really good at it. I mean, Kim Jong-un's grandfather was really good at it, and his father, and Kim Jong-un is too. So, and so within this changed geopolitical, our shorthand, transformed world, we need to think differently about how we work with our ally, Seoul. I do think the future of the Korean Peninsula runs through Seoul, and not through Pyongyang. About how we approach that. And if I may just tag one more thing, I think one thing that really struck me, and I'm interested in my Korean, I'm not moderator, but response to it is, I think it's significant that Kim Jong-un has made this very, public move to say reunification is off the table. We're 2 separate countries. South Korea, just leave us alone. And I hope that there are discussions going on at the governmental level and the diplomatic level about what that implies for our Not our, we don't, obviously Seoul is going to have its own policy towards North Korea, but I hope we're talking about these things. I think it's quite significant.
Yeah, when you think about the opinion polls we've read for years now that show that a significant majority of South Koreans argue for some kind of a independent nuclear arsenal. Is that lessening now? Or, I mean, it weakened for a little bit, but now that we're in this stasis that we were just discussing.
Well, there is a constant level of support, I think. Sometimes it's increasing, it's kind of volatile by the kind of rhetoric of the President Trump. But constantly more than 70% of South Koreans kind of prefer to have its own nuclear weapons. But considering the diplomatic and economic cost that might be imposed on South Korea for having nuclear weapons, considering that, the level of support is decreasing, but overall preference is kind of we need to have nuclear weapons. But the thing is that South Koreans, not only they prefer to have a nuclear weapon, at the same time, they also appreciate United States extended deterrence and also rotation of strategic assets on the Busan, and also conventional deterrence capability. So, which means that those four options are not mutually exclusive. South Korean, which rather it shows that South Koreans are more insecure about North Korea's nuclear threats, and we need to kind of develop a way to deter North Korea's nuclear threats, whatever that means. So that's kind of the whole point of nuclear polling, I guess.
If I convey my own view on it, obviously all these polls that you just mentioned and Dr. Jung also mentioned that were conducted mostly back in 2025 or 24 during a Yoon Suk-yeol administration era, where these polls I consider them as a push poll. These questions are pretty straightforward, manipulative. Questions are like, do you think that we should have a nuclear weapon? Given that North Korea has this much, then obviously public would go, of course. Therefore, so-called, support rebel.
So you think they show a deeper support than really exists?
And then a bunch of political scientists like us conducted another set of public opinion survey with conditionality, so-called. If we go nuclear, then we will be sanctioned. If we go nuclear, then our alliance with the United States will shrunk. If we go nuclear, then we will have to go through so-called North Korean way, then support level will just drastically go down to 20-something, very, very marginal. Now, obviously, if you say that, do we need a nuclear weapon? General sentiment might be very different based upon their own perceived way of security environment. But I don't think that we should generalize in a way that South Korea really desire for nuclear weapon on our own, based upon all this push-pull.
I perceived the same thing in the polls that Jong Kun just pointed out, but I also think it's important to add that there are conditions on the other side of that ledger that also have to be contemplated. So, for example, do you think South Korea needs a nuclear weapon if the United States decides to withdraw from the alliance?
That was what I was just about to ask
or
you.
do you think
is the bigger push here the North Korean threat or the President Trump's repeated references to withdrawing?
There's another one is if the United States decides to withdraw the extended deterrent. Another possibility is the United States accepts North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. Those are three conditions on the other side that could very much drive public opinion. And I think a fourth and an undefinable one is if you lose faith in the United States as an ally. Even if the structure of the U.S. South Korea security relationship is the same, if the policymakers' rhetoric in Washington undermines the confidence of the South Koreans that the United States actually will perform the role of defender in these instances, that too is an unmeasurable impact on people's decision to go proceed with a nuclear weapon. And at that point, it would be sanctions in NPT be damned. And I think we're much closer to that point than we're publicly discussing.
Sure, let me just follow with one quick question with Steve here, though. based on your experience with the president and given his statements in recent times about possibly withdrawing more from Europe and the experience we've seen with Germany, how likely do you think it is that he would withdraw the guarantee or would reduce force levels significantly enough that it would actually affect that public opinion?
I think it's possible. How likely, I don't know, but that it's possible has a corrosive effect.
I'm responding to Professor Cheh's point and also Steve as well. Yeah, considering all the kind of conditions like economic costs or diplomatic kind of cost as well, the kind of approval rating for the nuclear armaments might be decreasing. But we might have to notice that throughout these times, as we kind of measure this kind of approval rating for the nuclear armaments, the political taboo for not having nuclear weapon is kind of decreasing. That's the whole point. Kind of, it changed the environment or public opinion environments that we think about these nuclear weapons, and not only about the nuclear threats, and also at the same time, national kind of prestige also work as well. And at the same time, you mentioned about President Trump kind of rhetoric about withdrawing military forces out of Korean Peninsula. But the thing is that it is not just about President Trump kind of rhetoric, but kind of discrepancy between President Trump and the rest of the bureaucracy. Like a DOD and Strat Commands mentioned a strong commitment on the Korean Peninsula state deterrence, but at the same time, President Trump and like I'm saying different things. So that kind of discrepancy actually creating kind of uncertainty in South Korea's minds, I guess.
So if you are the Iranians and you look at the North Korean model here, do you conclude that North Korea had it right, that the fact that they rushed for a weapon and succeeded kept them from being in the position that Iran found itself in on February 28th? Or is the lesson a little more subtle and different than that, Kathy?
I don't know how the Iranians, I think you're in a better position or others to answer that. I mean, I'm quite confident the North Koreans think they definitely made the right decision.
Yeah.
And they said that, I mean, after Libya, after Ukraine, and I'm sure they think it now. And I think going back to the whole point about the non-proliferation regime, you know, there's the North Korean model has set you know, a very unfortunate, to put it mildly, precedent. But do the Iranians? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But the Middle East is a different place, as you know well.
Yeah. You have a view on that issue?
You know, you can't. You have to have the vector of time and the state of affairs, and they're met at different places. This moment of threshold nuclear potential that Iran is in is what we had in 1993 and 1994 in North Korea.
And President Clinton had an opportunity to go deal with it.
Right, and so he made a different decision, and he made a decision to agree to a framework, which is interesting because that terminology is back on the table right now with Iran in the negotiations. President Clinton agreed to a framework that today sees North Korea with more nuclear weapons than 3 other countries in the world, probably maybe 4 other countries in the world. It was very much instructive to me that the most important, it matters whether a country has more or less nuclear weapons. It's just is a matter of the risk it poses. Less is better than more. But the most important is between 0 and 1. And so what lesson did the Iranians learn? Perhaps the Iranians learned that they should have gone to 1. But the lesson that I hope the Iranians learned is that having a nuclear weapons program or pursuing nuclear weapons is more dangerous for you than not. That it's a detriment to security. What I hope the North Koreans learned from this is that possessing nuclear weapons outside of the framework of international law is dangerous. And what I hope the United States learned in 1994 is that important point that from 0 to 1 is the most important advance, not from 50 to 60 as the public report suggests is the size of the North Korean arsenal today.
Interesting you make a point. I think what Iranians may think and what the IRGC, the surviving IRGC leadership, which has ownership of the Iranian nuclear program, may think may be a different lesson. But yeah.
I'll be very careful comparing North Korea and Iran on par. Coming out of my own experience that I been to Tehran 3 times when they hijacked our tanker ship back in 21. My counterpart at that time was Abbas Arakchi. But obviously, I talked to Abbas Arakchi in order to get to IRGC, who actually hijacked our tanker ship. Took me about 20-something days to have our crew members released. And since then, I had a good working relationship with Abbas Arakchi. And what I learned is something like this. They always scratch their own backs and their heads because they said, we never walked out of NPT. We never kicked IAEA monitoring personnel on the ground. North Korea always did that. And we never conducted nuclear weapon tests. North Korea did that. And we even had a nuclear deal with the United States. North Korea did not do that. And we tried to keep it within the JCPOA framework. And the United States president walked away from it. So what wrong did we commit? That's sort of their mentality. And then they got bombed last year and this year too. And so I don't have any conclusive answer to your question because, as Steve just mentioned, today's Iran is the North Korea that we failed back in 1994. And obviously then remaining IRGC and the leadership. Mind you that their supreme leader was decapitated this time. So their intrinsic mistrust and animosity toward Washington, D.C. will be much more hardened to justify their political grip on the Iran domestic politics. And all the signals coming out of war in Iran that North Korea receives nowadays, I can only interpret, and they will say, see, I told you, sort of attitude and interpretation. And I think that from a South Korean perspective, it really also makes us scratch our own heads. Why? Because while bombing Tehran, President Trump also showcased his interest in talking to a North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. So it's a very, very oxymoron, very quagmire. So it's not really transparent at the moment.
Well, to take up a different part of the Iran experience, obviously South Korea is very dependent on Middle East oil. So they're quite concerned about the closing of the strait. Kathy, how do you think this could remake their thinking about the relationship with Russia? They're going to need some alternative sources. They obviously have a good trade relationship that's built up with Russia over this time. And how should we think about that in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, I believe that South Korea has already looked to Russia with for some help and energy challenges it faces, and I do think there has been a longstanding desire to have a strong relation with Russia. It's probably a bit constrained now by just how close North Korea and Moscow are. But talk of pipelines. I mean, I think longer term, we need to look back at history. I said Russia on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia, we haven't paid much attention to it for a number of decades. We haven't had to, but I think it's more important now. I think it could, in terms of as Korea looks at its energy options, make them a little more interested in the Alaska pipeline natural gas deal, which has been kind of talked about for some months with desire for not just South Korean but Japanese investment in that. Very, very expensive. Maybe the economics of that change a bit as South Korea
Price of oil is going
price
up.
of oil, over reliance. But Iran is an important partner, an energy partner for South Korea and of course for Japan. I think South Korea and Japan still have their embassies open in Tehran. still talking, and I do think, I mean, this is a little off your point, but I mean, getting back to, I mean, Steve's point about essentially trust, this is so important to our allies, I mean, economically as well as geopolitically, what's happening in Iran, how we conduct that I think this can be managed, but there has to be an awareness of the price they're paying. And I think we're paying a price in terms of a kind of a loss of some confidence and trust, and even aside from extended deterrence. But if we're going to do something that's going to so affect their countries, we as allies, we need to, it's just very simple, we need to talk about it.
Are you picking up much of this in Seoul? Is the strategic discussion about the relationship with Russia changing enough because of this?
Yeah, of course, there was a discussions, and actually regarding the Iranian crisis and its kind of oil supply chains, South Korea actually kind of contacted Russia for diversification as well. And also not only Russia, but also Qatar and other GCC countries has been contacted for diversification. But it is important to note that South Korea does not just move away from the United States for these regions, but try to diversify and try to maintain kind of autonomy in terms of oil supply chain kind of situation. But when it comes to Russia, I think there is a kind of ceiling when it comes to the cooperations and diversification, given that, as we all mentioned, Russia is kind of supporting North Korea and North Korea is also kind of supporting Russia in the Ukraine war. So I think even though we are kind of trying to diversify our energy supply chain with Russia, but there should be some kind of limitation, I guess.
Steve, if you were back in your old job, I don't want to send you through PTSD here, but if you're, how would you be trying to manage this energy crisis for South Korea and its potential impact on the alliance?
Yeah, so I certainly would go to the point that Kathleen recommended, with which I strongly agree, that we have to begin consulting and partnering with other countries that are affected by the implications of this war. The President Trump's admirers, supporters will often make a virtue out of his unpredictable decision making, but you have to have some predictability for friends, partners, and allies to be able to orient themselves in a manner that actually is beneficial and it multiplies the effect of what you're trying to do. We've done this before in the Persian Gulf. In South Korea has actually been oftentimes at the front of the line, helping ensure the security of maritime routes in the Persian Gulf in the past. South Korea sent warships, and South Korea has paid a price on being supportive of the United States Iran policy, including the seizure of several ships that Choi Jong Kun was responsible for freeing up. We've got to bring the other affected parties into the discussion as quickly as possible, and I think that's the first thing I would do, David.
John Choi, I was wondering if you would take us into something of a bit of a different direction here. One of the things that South Korea's discovered was one of its great sources of power in the past 10 years has been the fact that it's been such a major semiconductor force, not quite at the level of Taiwan Semiconductor, but Samsung's been impressive and at the leading edge and capable of doing things that we have not been able to do here in the United States. Is it your sense of the Lee administration that they view this as a central piece of their power and that there is a strategy to begin to exploit it so that they are not so wrapped up in the issues that we've been discussing here for the past 30 minutes of nuclear weapons, but instead thinking about where their leverage could be in the world of AI?
Very sensitive question to answer. First of all, personally, I'm a proud owner of Samsung stock.
Okay.
And also...
the rest of us here wish we were.
SK Hynix as well. Pretty feel good about it. Semiconductor has long been considered as a strategic element of South Korea's not only economic prosperity, but also for the so-called future pathway. But it is, ever since COVID-19, that we started perceiving semiconductors and reusable batteries and things like that as our strategic commodities, something that not only boosts up our national security in global supply chain, but also our leverage to link up with our ally, the United States, and our friends in Europe also. And also it is our strategic commodity that empowers with so-called strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the Chinese market. So I think that this administration has now realized that there are so many things that follow with this future commodity, so-called. But I think that what makes South Korea a little different than others is that we do not want to make it as a very much exclusive commodity, so sort of winner takes it all sort of element. In other words, we want it to be much more contributing to the sort of fair and equal growth in the global society as well. But at the same time, what bothers us at the moment, to be really frank with you here, is that we could have done a lot better between Washington and Seoul through free trade agreement, rather than having forced us to build a lot of factories in order to evade more and higher taxation on our commodities. If you talk to Samsung people or even Hyundai automobile people, they are building factories and plants here in the southern belt, so-called. And because of the tariff system, they need to bring in the machinery to build up, automobiles and batteries and things like that. That machine itself taxed with a new higher tax. In other words, what are we doing this sort of question? And plus, when there was a bad fiasco happening in Georgia, when our highly skilled labor was shackled, Korean people had this wake-up call. What the hell are we doing this?
That is the only incident in this second term that I have heard President Trump get out and basically apologize for. Apology is not usually the sort of standard currency of his conversation.
But I was also at the same time surprised that you did not witness any single Korean person in the Gwanghwamun Square protesting like an old-time anti-American sentiment. We are sort of mature and taken aback, and what are we going to do? In other words, I think the Koreans are now mature enough to say, hey, when it comes down to economic cooperation between two allies, what would be the maximal common goods that we can create? In other words, then you guys have to tell us that what kinds of America we are dealing with. You know what I mean? And I just want to make one very brief comment on Russia. I think the South Korea and Lee Jae-myung administration will be very, very careful about handling our Russian relationship, even if we have a energy crisis. 82 to 86% of our crude oil is traveling through the Strait of Hormuz. So very much vulnerable and sensitive at the same time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we just shift to Russian source of it, because when it comes down to energy source, what really matters is sustainability and predictability. But dealing with Russia, it still lacks it. And strategically speaking, would you like to talk to a nation that really helps out North Korea? So we'll be very much cautious about it.
Do you have a thought on this?
Totally agree with him regarding Russian part, as I just mentioned. Also, well, even though South Korea, especially Lee Jae-myung administration, tried to be more pragmatic compared to the previous administrations, but when it comes to this oil supply chain, as he mentions, Professor Choi mentioned, it's not just about an economic issue, it's kind of geopolitical issue as well. And increasingly this economic kind of economic strategy and security strategy kind of overlapping one another. So I think there would be some kind of limitation, I guess.
Steve, you spent a lot of time at Ford thinking about technology supply chains out here. As you look at the opportunity we have with South Korea and the approach we've taken, which is heard is one of trying to onshore this, does it make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunity is enormous, and like Jong-un, I'm surprised at the stamina and the commitment of the South Korean companies to fight through these barriers that have been put in their way to do what's immensely beneficial to the United States economy and to the South Korean economy. Now, these are also savvy business people. They know the scale of the U.S. market, and being close to the U.S. market is going to be beneficial. But it's immensely in our interest. You know, I noticed the same thing you did, that this was one of the very, very few moments when the Trump administration actually expressed regret or remorse for decision. I think because the president understood very quickly the implications of this. But I hope that that's not the end of it, because the president committed to create an expedited pathway for those important technical experts to be able to help install the equipment and work here.
He's talked about that, but I haven't actually seen it implemented.
I don't know if the president knows this, but his administration has not followed through on his commitment, and I think that's an embarrassment, because it is standing in the way of our own economic development.
Well, I could do this all day because it's such a great panel, but I wanted to leave, we only have got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to leave a moment for questions from some of you out there in the audience. I think we have somebody with a microphone, is that right? And so if there are questions, I'm trying to see here in the lights, just please let us know. Yeah, right here. And please give us your name and state the question as a question.
George Sheldon. Nobody's discussed the fact that the Kim regime's #1 priority is the enduring legacy of the Kim legacy. And it seems like U.S. policymakers failed to take that into account. We look for transactional issues that we could work with them with, overlooking that #1 priority.
Yeah, so one of the real challenges when you're negotiating with another party is not to project your expectations upon them. And so what we would design, for example, in terms of what the incentives are for North Korea, might not at all align with what their actual incentives are. And I thought about this a lot in our North Korea diplomacy, because in our North Korea diplomacy, certainly on the table, were an enormous range of incentives, from normalization to end of war to much more transparency, confidence building in security maneuvers on the peninsula. It included the lifting of sanctions, opening of investment into North Korea, any number of them. And by the way, tourism, travel, opening of borders. Now, you know, for us, if we're projecting on North Koreans, we think, oh, this is going to just make North Korea a much more prosperous place. And this was very much part of the president's strategy of a better future for North Korea. But if you're Kim Jong-un, job #1 is the survival of a dynastic totalitarian regime. And what about all of those incentives that I just described contribute to your ability to sustain a totalitarian dynastic regime in North Korea? To the contrary, they would actually erode the ability. And so, you know, that Hanoi didn't get to reach an agreement may have been in part because the North Koreans were asking for everything but not willing to give us enough. And they wouldn't ask for less and they wouldn't offer more. So we were stuck. But another very plausible reason why we weren't able to get any further than we're in Hanoi is what we were offering just really wasn't that interesting to Kim Jong-un. What good would come from the free flow of information into North Korea, American and Western and South Korean investors and business people, creating independent life sources of income and livelihoods for people? There's nothing about that shores up a dynastic regime. I think Kim Jong-un probably doesn't want any of that.
Anybody else out here? Oh, the mic's coming.
They can run.
Hi, thank you. Cyrus Jin of New York University. I'm curious about your thoughts on South Korea's relationship with ASEAN, with Southeast Asia. We've seen in the past year or two that Japan has become a pretty big lender of development assistance, of security assistance, really taking over a lot of U.S. roles in that respect. We've heard a lot about the U.S.-South Korea relationship. How is South Korea opinions on how it should be engaging with Southeast Asia, with the Indo-Pacific? How is that changing?
I think that I can answer that. Out of our trade portfolio, break it down to countries and regions, ASEAN nation has become our third trading partners. That happened very recently, since 2021. That indicates that South Korea is trying to not only diversify our trade portfolio, but also we are strengthening our relationship with our ASEAN friends also, because there are two strategic reasons. I mean, obviously we are very friendly to each other and we have good tourist, partners and all that stuff. First of all, we do not want to create a situation where we are way too dependent upon Chinese market. And that's why we want to work very closely with the expanding ASEAN nations. The second strategic reason is that there are hidden agendas. You know why? Because we don't want to be entrapped in a potential conflict that may occur in ASEAN theater or Southeast Asian theater. So we are essentially helping our ASEAN nation beef up their defensive capabilities also, so that we can be their very good partners also. Simply because we approach ASEAN partners with no hidden agendas there. In other words, we historically experienced a very similar path of colonization and decolonization. So we are very much in the same shoe, and we sort of share our know-hows on not only economic development, but also how we screwed our environment while we are growing up and things like that. So we try to very much share a lot of things with ASEAN nations.
Is there much of a sense that you're going to have to choose between Chinese and American large language models here? I mean, obviously, South Korea has been very successful on the hardware side of this, but we haven't seen a big competitor to OpenAI, Anthropic, even to DeepSeek. Anybody on this?
I mean, if I just jump on it, choice is not the word that I like to choose. Because choice is already made.
You're stuck with the American supply chain here. Yeah.
Not that I'm saying we are being stuck with it.
Yeah.
I think that we are enjoying it.
Yeah.
And that's why I am saying, with a very sincere voice, that what kinds of America are we dealing with? It's a very different America now that we are dealing with. So,
You are enjoying it now, but there's always a possibility you could see the U.S. government put some restrictions on their export as well.
Then I need to consult to the business sector's leaders,
Yeah.
what their preferences are there. But, I don't think that in market situation, they do not work in a very binary format. So it's very much pragmatic in a sense.
Kathy, do you have anything on this?
Well, I mean, maybe just on this question of technological competition. I mean, yeah, my sense is, the South Koreans are cheering for us, but as we're kind of making it harder, I think.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, clearly they're very aware that China's come a long way.
Yep.
And no one knows what the future holds for AI or who's, but the South Koreans on our side, but we haven't made it easy. And in addition to the visas and some of the, and I also mourn the death or the murder of the U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement, but R&D and advanced research and all the kinds of things that are more important now than and South Korea has more capabilities, and we need more from all of our partners than we ever have before. And I think we're making it too hard. And that's the broader atmosphere we're in, as well as the specific issues, which I also agree, like the visas, which hasn't been addressed. Although there's a little room now as you walk into the U.S. Embassy now, I can tell you this, just before you reach the Marine Guard to the left, it says business visa expediting, but I don't know what goes beyond. But there's a systemic, reform that needs to happen and hasn't.
Yep. Well, I think this was a big blow up the president had with his own folks when that took place. I think we have time maybe for one more. And yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll take two.
Hi, Chris Stockwell, retired Brigadier General, U.S. Army, former civil affairs officer in Korea, and president of the Korea Defense Veterans Alliance here in New York City. So the question has to do, General Brunson, the U.S. commander in Korea, has talked about that the bases in Korea, the forces in Korea could be used as a sustainment hub should some conflict break out in Asia. What are the thoughts of the Korean people and the Korean military and government when it comes to that? Thank you.
Good question. If you just pass your microphone that way to the young lady in the middle here.
So you guys talk. Sorry, I'm Christina Loenzon with Stony Brook University. You guys talked a little bit about how South Korea is maturing and thinking about the welfare of all countries moving forward. I was just wondering, do you think younger generations in the United States and South Korea view the alliance differently from previous generations? And if so, how should policymakers adapt to that shift?
Okay, so who wants to take the sustainment question?
I'll take that. And thank you, General. I appreciate you asking that because it's a topic that I wanted to come back to. Jong Kun talked about when we were counterparts, senior officials in our respective governments, that we talked about modernization of the alliance. And he talked about some very important ways that we can cooperate better to maintain peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. But there was an additional dimension of it, which is the role that that alliance plays in Indo-Pacific security. And I think this is actually the critical question we have to answer. My feeling on both the nuclear issues as well as the alliance issues is that we've been patching up the alliance here and there over the course of really the course of 2 decades or more. And we're running out of patches. We're kind of reaching a point where we need to do a couple things. We on the nuclear issues, we talked about that, about the second and third order effects of North Korea being a nuclear weapon state. But on the alliance, if it wasn't President Trump, it was going to be some other president who came into office and scratched their head and said, but this war ended in 1954. Why are 30,000 Americans defending 50 million South Koreans against 25 million North Koreans? And that the South Koreans have an enormous budget, have an enormous economy that's 50 times the GDP of North Korea. Now, I'm not at all minimizing the important security role the United States plays in partnership with Korea. I think it's a critical linchpin of our security interests in the Indo-Pacific. But if this alliance doesn't fill a larger role in the Indo-Pacific, then it's going to fall victim to some of the same forces that are devouring alliance relationships in the United States around the world, that it doesn't seem to be addressing the real pressing national security interests. And while I don't want to minimize in any way the threat that Kim Jong-un poses to the people of the Republic of Korea, I think it's very important to recognize that this level of commitment by the United States of America in the region has to be for a greater purpose than simply to defend the Korean Peninsula. And therefore, I think what General Brunson said very much reflects exactly the kind of thing we have to not to undermine or undercut the alliance, but rather to sustain it for another half century.
Interesting question on the generational shift. What do you think?
Because I'm working with students all the time. So yeah, I think the kind of younger generation, especially college students, have very different understanding about kind of international orders and geopolitical landscape surrounding Korean Peninsula. And regarding ROK-US alliances, they are very positive and optimistic. Even though we have President Trump and there's a very much fluctuation between two countries' relationship, They understand the kind of importance of these alliances and the strategic interests they are coming out of this relationship. At the same time, the relationship with Japan and as well as other partner countries are also well received in South Korean younger generations. But at the same time, they are very different from the older generation, like 40s and 50s and 60s, about the other countries' relationship, like China and Russia and North Korea. They have very different understanding, but when it comes to alliances, I think their support for the alliance is pretty robust, I think.
Well, I want to thank all four of you for a great conversation. I want to thank our audience here for their forbearance and their good questions. And we look forward to the rest of the conference today. Thank you very much.